1949 St. Louis exorcism, the story of possessed child Roland Doe was immortalized in the groundbreaking novel and film The Exorcist. Much has been written about the case, but the truth has been shrouded in secrecy until now. Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and this is Just Energy. Just Energy is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the services, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer. In this episode, hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and this is Just Energy. Just Energy is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer. In this episode, I'm joined by Stephen LaChance as he shares the shocking evidence of how a family's grief over the death of an aunt progressed into a full-blown demonic possession. While the conventional story is that Roland Doe brought the demonic infestation upon himself, LaChance convincingly suggests an alternative interpretation and provides new insights into the nature of possession itself. So please welcome the author of Confrontation with Evil, Stephen LaChance. Hey, Steve, how's it going?
It's going good.
I am just so excited to finally get you on this show and talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, entity attachment.
Mm-hmm. Mine too.
So I think we're going to have a great conversation, and with talking about your book, I think we're going to be able to give people that maybe think they have an entity attachment or a demon attached or a possessed or whatever that might be, some information,
Absolutely.
So I think this is going to be a great show. So what got you interested in this whole paranormal ghost entity topic in the first place?
Well, I moved into a haunted house in 2001. I was a single dad with 3 kids. And things started happening right away, and we actually ended up getting chased out of the house at one point. It followed us after we left the house. It stayed with us for about 10 years. So in the process of all that, it was like, Rita, you start telling people about what you're going through and the things that are happening, and all of a sudden I started getting people calling me, going, I have this going on with me and this going on with me. And I'm still trying to figure out my own thing, And so I'm looking for all kinds of answers, not only for me, but all of a sudden I have all these people that I'm trying to help too. So I figured, well, I better learn a whole lot about what I'm doing here, because there's a lot of people out there that needed help. And I knew that because of my own experience. In 2001, it's before we had all the television shows and all of that. So it was really hard to find help at that point. And so I wanted to be something that I could help other people plus help myself. I mean, there was a selfish reason to it too. I mean, it wasn't just, I wanted to go out and help the world. I was trying to find answers to my own problems. And that's what led me down so many different roads.
So were you already writing in the paranormal genre
No.
to that?
No, I was a producer for radio, and I was a broadcaster, and I was also a corporate trainer at different points too. I mean, I was like so far removed from this that you couldn't believe it. I mean, it's not something that I ever thought I would do. It's a lot of people go, well, were you skeptical? It wasn't really I was skeptical or I didn't believe. It was more along the lines of I just didn't give it much thought, and then all of a sudden you're struck with this thing and it's coming after you, and it's locking the children in rooms and not letting you get into them. I mean, I went through some pretty serious stuff, and you tend to believe really quick when all of that kind of thing is going on.
Wow. Well, we're going to have like an offline conversation about some of those details, because that's, I don't know, maybe a whole nother show.
Yeah, well, it really could be actually, because it's quite a story. So,
but your new book, and I feel like I have to say it this way, Confrontation with Evil.
Right.
delves into the true story that the movie The Exorcist was based on. But why dig into this story? Does it go deeper than the movie portrayed?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely much, much deeper. And the problem with it is I grew up in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, the Arch is just down the street from where I am right now. So I've always been a St. Louis kid. So, this story becomes such a part of your youth and growing up here in the city because there's so much urban legend, there's so much hype, there's so much sensationalism that goes around this story. So, when I started looking for answers of my own case and what was going on with me, what's the best thing to do but go to one of the best cases in the world? So, I've been researching this for like 10 years now. And I thought, well, and when I got into it, what got me really interested into it is I realized that the stories that were being told just didn't gel. They didn't fit right. And, those of us that have lived with an attachment understand how these things work. The walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's a duck. Well, there was things about the stories and how they were being related that just didn't ring true, And another thing was the locations. Everybody talked about the different locations and how many locations they were. This boy was exorcised in more places than Daniel Boone slept. So it was a way to do this, and I decided, well, okay, let's go ahead and we'll do the book. And the book was actually, I'll tell you about the first day. You guys will love this. The first day of writing the book, you get you know how this goes. You get all your research together and you sit down to write. And I always write to music. And I like listening to music while I write. I always say I should put a soundtrack to the books. But so anyway, I sat down to start working on it. I'm listening to Ave Maria. And I look over and I see my older son's dog, she's a border collie. She's pacing back and forth and she's growling up the stairs. And I'm like, well, that's weird. I even go up to check to see what she was looking at. There's nothing there. So the dog's pacing back and forth, growling. Ave Maria's playing, and all of a sudden there comes a knock on the door. So I go to the door, and there's two guys in white shirts and black ties. I answer the door, and they go, "Do you have God in your life?" And I said, "You got to be kidding me." And that was the first day of writing the book. I knew at that moment I was on to the right thing. I called my editor, and I said, "We are doing the right thing. Trust me on this." I'm a big believer in, the right thing at the right time. And there was a need for this one, I believe.
Mm-hmm. When I wrote my book, Dark Angels, An Insider's Guide to Ghost Spirits and Attached Entities, I had all kinds of spirits showing up in my house, and I had to stop writing it because they're not allowed in my house. They can be at your house.
No.
Not allowed at my, all right, not at your house. We can pick somebody's house, Dakota's house. We can send them to Dakota's house.
We'll send him to Dakota.
And I was like, no. You can't all stand at the bottom of my bed. And just stand there and stare at me because I'm not talking to you, and y'all need to go. Y'all need to go. But I did finally write it, Anyway.
I think that's a tuning in that you do when you write something along this nature. You're living in this case, this young boy. I was living in his mind, so there were times when, it would get a little creepy and I'd have every light on in the house, I gotta admit. There were those moments. And there were the nightmares that come with that, and the visitation kind of thing where you wake up and you have people standing in the room. That kind of stuff was going on, and it was a little creepy. I'm not so sure I would have, knowing what I know now, I'm not so sure I would have done it again though, because it was kind of stressful for a while.
I'll bet. So let's talk a little bit about Roland, about this boy, and what was he like, coming into this whole experience? Were you able to get some history on who he was? Yeah,
I did. And it was interesting because I went out and I was looking at different interviews of people that knew him as a boy. There were there was signs that there could have been something going on very early on with him. There's talk about him going out killing animals. He seemed a little troubled at times. Now, this is interesting to me because knowing in these cases and how we usually see how these things usually go, people are usually at a negative point in their life. There's some type of dysfunction going on, and there appears to have been something in the makeup of what he was going through at that point. All the interviews that I've read kind of suggest it. And I'm always really careful about, what you would say or what you would assume. There definitely seems to be, there was something in his makeup at a very young age that he was dealing with. And it became kind of clear as I started into the book, writing it and going through the different research and the diary and that sort of thing. It started to become very clear that there was definitely some dysfunction there.
Would you, and I just am trying to get him in my mind. Was he kind of characterized as a quiet boy or
He
an
was.
empathic boy?
Well, I didn't get empath out of it. What I got out of it was interesting was he was quiet. He was kind of reserved. He was kind of standoffish from other children. He would rather play, well, to give you an example, the story that we've all heard, he would rather do the Ouija board and play with his aunt than be out with the other kids. I mean, so there was a sense of reserve. Now, whether that was because of the mother and some of the things going on there.
Which we'll get into in a little bit.
Right. Well, we'll
Yeah.
get into that in a little bit. But, whether that was the case it remains to be, I guess we'll never know. But it does appear that there were some things definitely going on with him. And I think she kind of kept him away from other children, too. It seemed like he was the typical kid that might get picked on at school, even.
Mm-hmm. But see, that's makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. It does, doesn't it? I mean, really, and what struck me about it, Rita, is when you get into it, you see this vulnerable child, and he's a child. He's 13 when it starts, 14 when it's over. He's vulnerable, going through puberty. He's obviously got something going on that he's dealing with dysfunctionally. And I see this innocent. And he was innocent in a lot of ways, and it really comes through, because of the transient nature of possession. One moment he's doing these crazy things, and things are flying across the room, and the next moment he's playing Monopoly. He's a boy again. And it really touched me in the fact that so many times they make such a monster out of it. He's this horror movie monster. No, that was not the case at all. And it really, really got to me that we're talking about a child here. We're talking about a young boy with all the things that young boys deal with, and he was not a monster. And there were so many things around him that were not working in his favor. And we'll tell you, like you said, we'll talk about that.
Well, and you mentioned him playing with the Ouija board. So is that what you think attracted the entity to him in the first place?
Well, I think there was a lot of that going on. I think he was doing it with his aunt. I think maybe, it kind of showed a light on it. Maybe it was the entrance point. But what gets interesting is a lot of times within possession, we know that the possessed is not necessarily always the target. And especially with children, it's not that. It's usually the case. It's usually is the parent. And in this case, it turns out. Well, let's go into the diary a little bit.
Okay.
I think we need to explain what the diary is. When there was a diary that was written by Father Raymond Bishop. Father Bishop took part in the exorcism. He assisted Father Baldern, who was the head exorcist, and actually he was the first contact with Roland. He wrote a diary, which is a day-by-day below of what happened. Now, this is a historical document that he wrote for the church itself. It was never supposed to be out there for public consumption. It was an internal history of what happened. Now, what makes that interesting is it becomes the most accurate telling of what happened to this boy, because there was no predisposition to it. There was no purpose for writing it other than the fact of to record the history. So it makes it a really, really good starting point. You get into the diary, and I started into the diary, and it starts out and it gives you the background and such. before it goes into the day by day. But what was interesting to me is the activity starts, and you start hearing scratching noises like you always do. As a matter of fact, the father at one point thought it was a rodent. Okay, he actually has somebody come out to check it. There comes a point when it gets quiet, and then Roland's the only one hearing the noises, and then the activity increases. And when it increases, there's a part in the diary that struck me. The mother is on the bed with the grandmother. They're holding the boy. The bed's shaking. There's sound of marching feet going up and down the bed. I mean, this is a horrific moment going on. It's terrifying. And what does the mother do? Now, the aunt that he did the Ouija board had died. The mother, instead of getting on the phone and calling somebody, she calls out and she goes, "Is this Aunt so-and-so? If this is you, knock 3 times." What? I thought that was interesting. And not only does she do it once, she does it twice. And I'm like, well, everything to this point says that she was this good Lutheran woman. Now, mind you, this is at the end of the spiritualism movement. A lot of times I gave her the benefit of the doubt on the fact of, a lot of times people would go to church, on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, they were contacting the dead. So I thought, okay, well, this is probably that. But then I went on. All of a sudden, words start forming on the boy's body. And that's how she knew to take him to St. Louis, because St. Louis comes onto his body, and she had family in St. Louis, and that's what she thought it was telling her. Now, the boy describes these words as they came onto his body, and they would come in brands and scratches, as it being very painful, like he was being branded. He would scream out in pain. But this is what was interesting. The mother stands there and she keeps asking questions. When should we go to St. Louis? How long should we stay there? Each time the boy's screaming out in pain, it almost becomes a Saturday Night Live skit. I mean, really, it does. And,
And do the answers show up on his body?
And the answers are showing up on his body, and he's in extreme pain. So, nobody's ever talked about this. And I'm going, what in the world? And I guess, in the moments of people are always looking for the thing that looks like the movie, that they miss the point that what was happening here. This mother, who should have been the one person this boy could go to, who she could, that should have showed him the mother's love, is standing there asking questions as her child is screaming out in pain, and she continues the activity, continues it. So I was like, okay, we got something wrong here. This is something going on. So,
well, let me just interject a comment. Based on her activity, based on her behavior, it seems like, you're right that she was like into the spiritualist movement, and, it was a spiritually open household. Like in my house, you didn't talk about tarot cards or psychic stuff. We did talk about ghosts because we had one that lived in our basement. But it wasn't conversation, we would never get a Ouija board, kind of thing. But it sounds like in that household, talking to a dead person was okay. Kind of like you hear people like, well, my grandmother was a psychic and my mom was a psychic, and so it was okay to be a psychic.
Right. And that's exactly what it is. And what's interesting, you see, a lot of people think that they came to St. Louis for the purpose of an exorcism. Now, she did try to find some help. She goes to a spiritualist who says there's nothing wrong with him. She goes to a psychiatrist that says, well, he's just a young boy going through things. She goes to a medical doctor that can find nothing medically wrong with him. She takes him to the Lutheran minister, which is really interesting when she does this, because I found out in the research the Lutheran minister was actually in communication because he was into the paranormal, and he was studying the boy, and he was reporting to the Rhine Institute at that point. That's really interesting. So, he kind of lets him down. Actually, there's 2 stories that, one, he claims he tied him to a chair, another claims that he was tied to a mattress and the mattress flew under the bed and he was slammed against the springs of the bed. I mean, either way, this guy let him down. She goes to a priest. Now, there's a lot of questions about that, whether, the priest at one point, according to eyewitness accounts, says there was an exorcism in Georgetown. The diary says there wasn't, which is very interesting. Counters it completely. And we get into that in the book. But, so she comes to St. Louis. Now, she doesn't come to St. Louis because she's looking for help for the boy. It's not for an exorcism. As a matter of fact, when they get to the house in St. Louis, the first thing she does is she goes to an alphabet medium and brings him to the house. And
What's an alphabet
well,
medium?
it's the way it's described in the diary is they place letters out onto I guess it was the kitchen sink they used there, and it's sort of like a Ouija board in itself, that sort of thing. I imagine it's probably you remember how the people did with the cups and stuff. I imagine it's along those lines. But so his cousin sees all of this going on. Now she's going to St. Louis University. And she realizes, well, there's something seriously wrong with my cousin. I got to go get him out. So she goes to her professor, which is Father Raymond Bishop, who wrote the diary. And she goes, my cousin needs help. So he gets permission to come see the boy. Now, during one of his first visits, we find out, and this is in the diary, by the way, it's so clear, it's so frustrating to me that no one ever talked about it, because in the diary, it says that the family is standing around the boy asking questions, which we all know when they appear on his body, he's screaming out in pain, and they're asking questions about where the dead aunt's money was buried. Yes.
Are you kidding me?
No. She was using her son as a Ouija board to find money.
Well, I was kind of getting that earlier, but that's
interesting. And no one has ever talked about it. You and I do the same thing.
It kind of sounds like the mom's a little
right.
herself.
So you and I knew the same thing, and you know what it's like when you get something that no one else has ever talked about, and it's right there in front of you, and you're like, how do people miss this? I mean, you could have peeled me off the ceiling. I could not believe that this mother would do this. And, and what it told me instantly is, this boy is nothing but an oracle. He has become a human Ouija board for the mother's purpose, and the target of the possession was not the boy, it was the mother. And as a matter of fact, at some point in the diary, the mother has an apparent breakdown, and she goes away for a little while,
Well, and is the boy better when the mom's not there?
No, he continues. By that point, it's so bad. You've gone past the oppression stage into possession, and we all know that once the demon gets hold, it's not going to let go. It's having fun now, because now it's got the priest involved. It's got all the attention that it wants, and the more attention you feed it, what's going to happen? It's going to get worse. So this is what is going on, and he goes downhill from there. And it gets much, much worse throughout the thing.
So does it start as episodic instances, where something will happen and then a few months, go by, or 6 months go by and then another episode? Or was this really all consolidated into a very short period of time?
It was in a very short period of time. Now, I believe that there was probably maybe some things going on a little earlier than we know because of his behavior. But it was from January until April. It was the day the exorcism concluded on the Monday after Easter. I mean, so you're talking about 3 months. I mean, that's a very short period of time. So I do that all the time too. So that's in as far as possession goes, this is really a case that went pretty quick. It didn't take years to get it off his back. And that's pretty interesting in itself, I believe.
Well, and I have another question, but I have to just write it down because it's not time to ask it.
Okay.
Wow, this is just really fascinating. I mean, because, my thought about possession was that it's something that, we get into a bad space, whatever, and we attract it to us. But it sounds like, it was this whole kind of family affair.
Mm-hmm. It was a whole type of family affair. And but you look at the boy at that point, and no wonder the negativity is drawing on him at that point too, because he feels isolated. he has this thing going on. The one person that he should be able to rely on is causing him pain. You know, anytime that anybody tries to help him, it seems it goes very, very bad. The people that should support him have pretty much gone away. He can't go to school. When he was in school in Maryland, by the way, they said his desk in class one day started moving like the planchette would on a Ouija board. It would be, yeah, it was spinning. And, you know, so all the children, you know, his friends and that he had were all away from him at that point. I mean, the pure isolation, and you got to go, well, just from the fact of what puberty is for a child, too. I mean, you take all of that and put it together. Yeah, he himself started feeding into it.
Do you blame him?
I don't blame. No, I don't blame him. And you know, and that's the thing. And as a matter of fact, the book I dedicated the book to him because I don't think he's gotten a fair shake in the telling of his story. I don't, and you know, and I felt very strongly. And maybe it's because I had lived through something myself with children, and I could, you know, even though it was not connected to me, I could see my own children dealing with something, and I felt, you know, I felt really, really sympathy for him, a lot of empathy, you know.
Well, but the mom seems kind of narcissistic.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
I don't know where the father is in this whole
He's not in
thing.
St. Louis at first. Now, he actually does come to St. Louis when it gets really, really bad. I think, you know, to me, I think he was the kind of father I was at the beginning, which is, you know, I don't really believe this. I think this isn't really happening. You know, I think it's something, I imagine he probably thought it was something medical or psychological with the boy. You know, you try to find, and I know how this is, you try to find excuses and everything. But once it gets to a point where he's in really severe trouble, and it's obvious, the father shows up. And the mother actually has a breakdown shortly afterwards. But there's a moment in the diary that I found really interesting, and it's when the father gets to St. Louis. And there's a scene where the father is dressing the boy in his pajamas. And I was like, wow, you know, this is something. You know, this dynamic. You have this mother who's not very motherly, but this father who's kind of overly fatherly. And I'm like, this is really something. This is a human story. This is not a horror story. You know, and the human side of it is what really, really struck me. And not only from the father, but everybody that becomes connected to it, their backgrounds and their stories and what was going on with them becomes almost more interesting than the boy himself.
Kind of on the side question. So when the father was there, did the boy end up having the raised letters, or was it more when the mom was interacting with the boy that would become part of the story?
It became obviously all the time after a point where it was constantly happening. It started with her, and then, you know, once you give this thing a way to communicate and it knows you're going to pay attention, so you got everybody looking at this point, wanting to see what it's going to say and what given point is it going to talk about. And then I think, you know, that's kind of interesting, you know. At that point, it's almost like you hit that point of no return. And he obviously hit there.
So do you think, or how common do you think full-blown possessions like this one are? I mean, you know, we're talking about entity attachments and ghosts that don't want to leave and that kind of thing before the show. But, I mean, this is a full-blown possession.
Very, very rare. This is very rare. I have been doing this work for a long, long time, and so have you. And I can tell you there's a very, very, very small percentage of things which actually that you could probably label possession. There's a lot of people out there who think they're possessed, by the way. But the truth of the matter is it's very, very rare. It's a rare occurrence. There's some that indicate that there's a rise in the occurrences. We see in the Catholic Church is training more exorcists. And, you know, and I think that plays into the whole idea of, well, let's talk about late William Peter Blatty. When he wrote The Exorcist, he thought he was doing God's work. He thought he was going to bring people back in the church. But I think what actually happened, and maybe this was the goal all the way back to 1949, what actually happened is I think he did the opposite. He put the spotlight on evil. The spotlight didn't go on goodness, it went on evil. And I think maybe we see a rise in these cases when we see that spotlight brighten a little bit. You know, we saw it in the 70s, you know, we saw it recently. And, you know, and I think that's what's going on. Is, you know, and as the veil thins, maybe it's easier for them to come through as well.
That's Stephen LaChance. His book is Confrontation with Evil. His webpage is stephenlachance.com. And thank you for watching this portion of our interview with Stephen. If you're enjoying today's programming, please click on the button below and subscribe to our channel. If you want to hear this interview in its entirety, become a Just Energy Insider at justenergyradio.com and access full shows commercial-free and gain access to our over 10 years of show archives. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So until next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy. Be blessed.